We are going to go to our next presentation and last from FIU. It's in a fantastic topic. I think if we want to choose a winner today, this topic is the winner. It's about use of canines as a corrosion detective device, and Dr. Kenneth FURTON of FIU is presenting. Dr. FURTON?
Thank you, everyone. It's you always, if you have babies or dogs, you get a lot of attention. But so I'm going to be talking about the project we're working on using canines as a corrosion detection device. And this is a project that's I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on. Over the past 25 years, I've worked in the use of canines to reliably detect a number of different kinds of materials. And so this project builds on work we've done with explosives, illicit drugs, microbes, human scent, mass storage devices. I'll give you a little bit of a background on that just to show you that it is capable of doing this. There was the only work that's ever been done in this area that we've been able to find was back in 2014. A colleague in the Netherlands, Ade Schoen, did a project which looked at corrosion under insulation on pipes, but it was not related to this kind of a project with the bridge engineering, but it was a very limited pilot, but shows that there is that capability. So I'm just going to outline what we believe could be a new cost-effective, efficient, and reliable method for corrosion detection. For about 30 years, as I mentioned, we've been doing work in various different areas. I'll just share with you that we're also at FIU has been leading the development of national standards. So even though canines sometimes are considered low tech, they actually are increasingly being tested at levels similar to instruments. So there are ANSI, American Standards Board standards that have now been developed. So canines have to be over 90% reliable in terms of accuracy and less than 10% false alert rates. And so all the dogs that we're working with are trained according to these ANSI standards for canine detection. During COVID, we actually trained dogs for COVID-19 detection. And we basically just took face coverings of people that were in the hospital that had COVID and those that did not have COVID. We tested the canines. You can see here at the bottom, we have a training wheel in which the dogs are able to have blanks, positive controls, negative controls. And then in the lab on the right is an image of what we do is we take that same material that the dog's being trained to alert to, and we test it in the laboratory using something called solid phase microextraction. And we actually do overnight extraction. So you'll see at the bottom on the right hand side, there's like a little vial and a little piece of the face covering that people were wearing. Those same materials would be in the exposed to the dogs for testing. Surprisingly, the dogs were actually very accurate. So on the left is the results of that's what's called SPME GCMS, headspace SPME GCMS. You can clearly differentiate the volatile organic compounds coming from people with COVID and those without. And the dogs were trained in double-blind experiments at over 97% accuracy. So it turned out overall accuracy of 97.5%. So we've done this in a variety of different areas. So for drugs, pyranol is a dominant odor for ecstasy, MDMA. We've done it for explosives and human scent. They could detect very low levels of human scent. Most recently, we were able to show that mass storage devices, canines can detect incredibly low amounts. So people will hide a small SIM card, and we've been identifying the VOCs associated with the SIM cards and showing that the dogs can very accurately detect the chemicals coming off of these electronic devices. So this is just a video showing the dog detecting a mass storage device hidden in a warehouse. And the work with this in terms of human scent has demonstrated that this was a case that I worked in which I was assisting in the developing standards and training dogs for human scent detection. And dogs were able to trail from an ATM machine half a mile to a suspect's home in red. And they did a search warrant and they found DNA matching that suspect. And it turned out that person had stolen the victim's ATM card, used it at the ATM machine, and two dogs were able to follow that person's human scent for a half a mile and identify the location where they subsequently had the search warrant. So they can detect extremely low amounts. So this project basically has 4 tasks. We're basically working on getting the dogs familiar with the target odors, embedding the odors within concrete cylinders, similar to what you would find for a bridge engineering project. And then we're looking at the dog's ability to first detect the odor coming out of the concrete. The second task is we're working on training the canines to be able to detect corrosion products. So starting with iron versus iron oxide, and then looking at corroded objects. And then looking at the threshold. So dogs can be trained to a specific threshold. So accelerant detection canines are trained to 10 microliters of what's called a weathered gasoline as a training aid. They won't detect below, and they can detect higher levels. So you can calibrate the dog essentially. Then the last 2 tasks are identifying those VOCs using that method I showed you, Headspace, SPME, GC, mass spec. Determining if there are VOCs, which we suspect there will be, at least for the canines. We don't know for sure whether the laboratory piece will give us the same detection levels. And then we're ultimately looking at detecting that corrosion at a particular level in the concrete cylinders using the canines. So this is what we've currently worked on. So we have what we call a controlled odor mimic permeation system. So it delivers a particular amount of odor very accurately over a constant rate. And we've embedded those within concrete cylinder molds. We pour the concrete, and then this is on the right is actually a model, because you can't see it, you just see a concrete block, but those controlled odor mimic permeation devices are embedded in the concrete. And then we use that as part of our training just to see whether the odor can then come out from a concrete structure with enough enough amount that the dog's are able to alert. And so these dogs that we did in the first trials they were previously exposed to odors. We're focusing on pyranol, which is an odor, a pure odor found in ecstasy. That's what's embedded in the current concrete structures. And then this is the lineup. It's basically just like a lineup, and the dogs are trained to go to each of those concrete cylinders and sniff, and that you'll see the handler kind of push, making sure the dog gets their nose near the cylinder. If the odor is there, the dog is trained to sit. Sometimes they get very excited. You'll see the video, I think, if it shows, is that the dog actually knocked over the cylinder when one of these cylinders had the odor of pyranol. And then these are actually just, the law enforcement canines that have been trained for this odor. So, but we will eventually be training, in the process of training, a couple of dogs for corrosion odors. And so here's the actual lineup with the pyranol in one of these cylinders, and you should be able to see which one it is when the dog runs it. So, and in the laboratory, we were able to show that the pyranol odor is coming through the concrete cylinders. So we know that the odor will permeate out from an embedded object. So this is the current timeline that we're working under. We're in the process of now working on training the dogs for corrosion products versus that initial target odor, identifying the VOCs associated with corrosion, and then ultimately running those same kind of experiments with corroded materials versus non-corroded materials, and then working on the calibration piece. So I want to thank Kingsley Lau for his laboratory is currently where we're doing the work and the guidance on the corrosion. And Kelvin Frank, who is works between both of our labs, the FURTON lab and Kingsley's lab. It's it's a pretty challenging project involving engineering as well as working and training the canines. And I want to thank Kelvin, who's the one coordinating this. And then finally, just thank my research group. Like I say, working on various different aspects of canine odor detection and the opportunity to be part of this this ongoing project. I think it's a very exciting. At least the initial results show that there's the potential's there. We just have to continue to work on it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. FURTON. It definitely is. It's interesting, and I mean, for people who have been in the airports and see, for example, the canines coming and smelling or so, I always have had respect for dogs doing that job. They are the best technicians possible. There are a couple of questions came in. One is asking, are dogs able to detect odors if they cannot get close to the source? Basically, what would be the distance, that minimum distance that needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the it really depends on what the application is. So right now, most dogs, like you see at the airport, are trained to alert when they get very close to the source. So they don't necessarily have to put their nose on the object. But it's really based on the application. With COVID detection, we actually did deployed dogs that we had trained in the laboratory at the Miami International Airport, and they would get within maybe about a foot of the face coverings, and then they would sit. If the person had COVID, they would pick up the odor and sit. For explosive detection canines, people have trained them for much further distances, so that it could be many meters away. As soon as they get into the odor, they're trained to sit down. In places like in London, the dogs are actually trained to bark alert. So rather than because if they just sit, you may not know where they're at, and so they start barking if they're picking up odor from a distance. So we for this project, we believe depending on what we want, to calibrate the dog at a particular level, and then how close you want them to get to the source, because obviously they won't be able to get right to an area where the corrosion is occurring. So that will be part of the refinement of the project.
Yes, and I think you are. Sometimes we say lab condition is better than the field or so, but the way I see, you are basically doing the worst case scenario, because in the case of concrete, for example, normally corrosion of the rebars are associated with cracking of concrete or so. So if there is a cracking, I'm guessing their sensitivity will even increase further. Is that a good understanding?
Yeah, I think that's correct. It's I find it remarkable how sensitive the dogs can be, and again, it's going to ultimately come down to the training, and then usually we combine the dogs with sensors, ideally, because in the case of, let's say, if a dog alerts out in the field in a matter of a second, basically they can pick up the odor and they find a white powder, then we take it to the lab and we do further testing with it. The challenge with the instruments is that they can be as sensitive as the canines, but they take much longer. So you might, usually it'll take 24 hours, or in some cases longer than that, to do the analysis in the lab. So that's a big advantage of the canines. And then sensors in the field are being developed. So if you could combine the two, that would be ideal. So that's, but that's a good point, is that I believe that we're kind of in the worst case scenario at this point. It likely would be easier for the canines to pick up an odor out in the field.
Yeah, and actually you just touched on this answers to this question, but let's see if you have anything to add. The question is asking, how does the sensitivity of dogs compared to instruments?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So in most cases, we found that the dogs are more sensitive than any instruments we've developed. And I've been working, I'm an analytical chemist by training, and my lab's full of instruments. And I got involved with the canines just as a complement. But what I found, like with that case that I showed you, which was a serial killer up in Wasilla, Alaska, two dogs were able to follow the scent of just human scent, shed skin cells, over half a mile in winter conditions in Alaska. We were not able to pick up any odor, so we did sampling using the same device that they presented for the canines, and we just couldn't detect the odor. So in that case, the dogs are definitely more sensitive. Now, as instruments get better, maybe that gap will close, but generally the dogs tend to be more sensitive and more selective. They're able to differentiate odors very quickly. So you can, and literally in a matter of hours, you can train dogs off of different odors. So in the case of a corrosion product that you may not want to be looking at, you could train the dogs off of that. They call it proofing, and it's very, very efficient for that. With an instrument, it's hard to do that because now with AI and ML and there are components that will make the instruments get better, but I think right now canines still have a superiority.
Yes. Well, that's great to know. One thing that last time we were talking, we touched upon was that not always corrosion is encased in the concrete. So we have exposed corrosion. Of course, our bridge inspectors can see it, but there are also, we came to that conclusion, there are also cases that inspectors cannot see or cannot get to the location. So that would be also a not byproduct, but a big advantage coming out of your study, really.
Yeah, that's a great point, because in the case of like within forensic science, dogs are part of a working group. There's 22 different areas of forensic science, and they use canines as a biological sensor. And they're typically the best way to locate a crime scene and then to locate objects in a crime scene. So in some ways, this would be the same way, right? They would just be a way to screen and say, okay, you need to do some more detailed analysis with maybe instrumental methods with the canine. So they're a great tool in that regard. They generally are not a confirmatory method, but that's a great point in terms of the potential application down the road.
Thank you very much, Dr. FURTON, for your time.